How do we prevent, and what is the European role in preventing us from having this conversation 12 months from now?
Well, I think it's important that we stick to the basic principles that there's one aggressor and one victim. Why is it important? It's important because at the negotiation table there should be clear demands on the Russian side. Right now we see a lot of pressure on Ukraine, who's the weaker part, to concede territories, to give in what the aggressor wants, but actually we don't see much pressure on the Russian side. Of course, the European position has always been very clear to put the pressure on Russia, and we are working on that, but also around the negotiation table there should be very clear demands to Russia.
So the European position has been clear. European action has become less clear, particularly over the last 24 or 72 hours, in which we had a failure to deliver the 20th sanction package yesterday. Over the weekend, we've heard from Viktor Orban basically now stepping out of line with the agreement for the 90 billion euro loan to Ukraine. Where do you see the path forward for both of these initiatives now, given where we stand?
Well, this is a very unfortunate development because all the leaders agreed around the European Council table in December to provide the loan, and also we have been working on the 20 sanctions package. Now there is a veto on both of them. Of course, we are working with Hungary and Slovakia on different levels to find a solution, but this is very, very unfortunate. Of course, on the positive side, we have seen this before, and we have always come to outcome and solution in the end.
And there's also a sort of deadline looming. We understand that the loan package was going to begin to be dispersed in April of this year, and that was sort of seen as the critical moment to get some of this funding to Ukraine. If there's not a resolution by then, what are the options? Does this put, for example, the Russian assets back on the table?
I think so, yes, because this loan was a plan B, actually, because, there were some countries that were opposing to the frozen assets, but it's clear that Ukraine needs this funding in April, and like many analysts have said, this could be a game changer for this war, to send a clear message to Russia that you can't outlast us, and we are supporting them to defend themselves.
And do you think there is going to be the legal framework to try to move on those Russian assets? Obviously, that was the point of failure last time, particularly with the Belgians still objecting to that. Do you think that that has evolved? Has there been legal work happening in the background to try to make that more viable?
No, there hasn't, because there was this 90 billion loan, and we were moving quite well on this track, also on how this, there's flexibility for using this money, considering the Ukrainian priority and urgent needs that they have. So of course there has not been any work regarding the frozen assets in meantime, and we should right now, focus on solving this issue on the 90 billion loan. There is discussion on the leaders level and different options on the table, but if that's not going to work out, then of course the frozen assets is a possibility.
And so sort of Hungary and Slovakia to a certain degree is not a new dynamic within the European Union, particularly on the question of Ukraine. That being said, there's one thing that these two nations share, and they both had a visit from Marco Rubio in days after the Munich Security Conference. I wonder what your perspective is on that, not to sort of enter into potential conspiracy or anything like that, that this is the U.S.'s influence. That being said, it does give these two nations a direct line to the United States and potentially emboldens them to go against European policy because they have the United States as a very clear sort of stated ally. What is your perspective?
Well, America has been very clear that they want this war to end. So if you want this war to end, then we should really do everything to put the pressure on the aggressor. And what the 20 sanctions package would do, in addition, we see that Russia's economy is not doing well at all. Their approach has been to put pressure on the victim, on Ukraine. It hasn't really delivered in 1 year. Results, so maybe we should focus now on the other side. So clearly it would be also in their interest that these things go through.
And sort of appraising the European kind of stick and carrot in terms of being able to put pressure on Russia or help out Ukraine. Obviously, there's the funding question that is now in sort of jeopardy. There's a question of sanctions also now reaching some issues. There's also the idea of joining the European Union and this being part of the framework for a peace agreement from the Ukrainian side. Given how much difficulty there's been with the two sort of former, where do you see the sort of path in the discussion around accession to the European Union for the Ukrainians, particularly given the resistance we're seeing from these member states?
Well, there have been some ideas circulated how we can approach this question, and then we really need to have these discussions on different levels. But what I want to stress is that, you know, anything around the negotiation table that requires, you know, European input also requires Europeans around that table. And anything that, you know, from the European side we are, you know, putting to the table should not also be without the concessions on the Russian side. So to be very clear, Ukraine's place is in Europe. They have been fighting for Europe and joining the European Union. So we definitely need to find a solution, but not only for Ukraine, but also the other countries that are candidates. And
some of the sort of issues that we've been talking about, or some of the things that are being discussed that you mentioned there, are membership light, for example, for the the accession to the European Union. Do we have a clear idea of what that would actually entail, just to put a little bit of meat around that debate? Because we hear these ideas floated out, but they're not really, strictly speaking, defined.
Yes, well, we haven't had those discussions, yes, last week I was also proposing that we would have these discussions on a broader scale, because clearly, if you know, member states, candidate countries are making their homework or doing their homework, then it shouldn't be that we haven't done our homework.
And also thinking about the United States, a relationship, we obviously had the Greenland a moment. I don't know if we can consider that a moment. I don't know if it's sort of gone for the time being. We had Marco Rubio sort of giving a sort of, I'd say, semi-reassuring speech over at the Munich Security Conference. Where do you appraise the United States relationship with the European Union today? Do we understand each other better at this stage?
Well, our relationship is definitely taking a heavy blow. That's clear for everybody. We are trying to work on this. Of course, it goes both sides. The relationship is two ways. So we definitely want this relationship to work. And are doing our efforts on our side, but you know, it takes two to tango.
And sort of tariffs obviously are now re-emerging. We had our tariff moment. It is now, you know, seems to be a tariff, you know, year plus. Just to get sort of, we're trying to assess kind of what the situation is, what the consequences are. At this stage, can you help us out assessing what the situation is and what the consequences are?
We are trying to assess this situation as well, because nobody understands if this 10% is now on top or how is it really playing out. Plus, you know, when we agreed to this trade deal, then one of the arguments was that our companies would have stability. You know, any kind of decision is better than, you know, hanging on and not knowing what is coming. So predictability is a value. Now it is again gone. So we are trying to make sense how the U.S. operates.
And so obviously trade is under Mr. Šefčovič's sort of remit, but obviously trade is also increasingly used as an instrument of foreign policy. Do you see a potential consequence of foreign policy in terms of the sort of disagreement or confusion around tariffs is now forcing the EU to delay their deal? Could that have, for example, consequences for the Ukrainians and U.S. support if, say, the Europeans are not moving fast enough in the minds of the United States?
Well, in a broader sense, of course, trade is very much linked to the foreign policy. And if you go around the world, then actually most of the countries in the world have been hit by tariffs, and nobody understands really why. So I think on our side, it's important that we are building partnerships with countries who still believe in free trade, and we are trying to diversify our trade portfolios so that, you know, we are not vulnerable in that sense.
And another debate that's been happening at the European level recently is this Made in Europe idea, this idea of sort of funding, particularly going on in the defense build-out, that they should be sort of made in Europe. Do we have an idea of where we're drawing the line of Europe? Is it including candidate countries? Should it include Ukraine? And, you know, the United States, should it be considered a trusted partner? Can you put a little bit of flesh on that debate for us?
Of course, we are building our own defense industry, and therefore, the defense industry also needs procurement. But at the same time, the world is very much interlinked. There are many elements that come from different countries, and definitely we work closely with our partners that we have security and defense partnerships with. We work closely with our partners in the region, so that we come up with the best way forward. That means bringing down the procurement costs, but also bringing down the procurement times that are so much needed.